Hello and welcome to the first session at the stage with the keynote lectures. I'm delighted to introduce the first speaker, Susan Carruth. Susan is an architect and researcher with 17 years of experience across practice and academia. Originally from Scotland, she trained as an architect before practicing in London for almost 10 years. In 2012, she relocated to Denmark to begin her PhD, which explored the sociocultural and spatial dimensions of renewable energy infrastructure. Following this, she was head of research and sustainable development for white architects in Denmark, before joining GXN in 2018. GXN approach advances systemic design solutions where resources circulate at maximum utility to enrich social, technical, and biological flows. They coined this approach as circular sustainability. GXN Innovation continuously collaborates with 3XN architects, integrating research and practice across both branches. Their holistic approach combines behavior, circular, and digital design strategies to push the boundaries of architecture. Susan's role as head of operations with GXN includes the strategic development of the Behavioral Design Research Cluster, sustainability and innovation consultancy, and project managing international architectural projects. Thank you very much, Susan, for joining us and sharing your experience at PLEA 2020.
I'm Susan Carruth, and I'm going to be talking to you today about GXN, specifically two things. One is about circularity design and how we have managed to scale up our knowledge there from material to city. And the second thing is something completely different. That's the role of behavioural design in sustainability discourses. Thank you. Thank you very much for inviting me to speak as part of this fantastic conference. I'm going to speak to you today about our work here in Copenhagen at GXN. I took this from the themes of the conference about being about the interplay between research, technology and design in defining and planning future cities. And what I really wanted to do was just to add in one extra clause into that, which is about the interplay between research, technology and behaviour as well as design, because that's what I'm going to talk about today. So I'll start with an introduction to GXN and our relationship with 3XN architects. And then there's kind of a lecture of two halves. The first speaking about circularity and how we've managed to scale up that knowledge, and I'll showcase various projects and case studies. And then I'm going to switch to behavioural design and talk about the role of that in sustainability and why we believe it's just as important. So this is where I'm sitting right now. We have beautiful old boathouse offices in Copenhagen. And as this image here shows, all under one roof, we've got a competition department, we've got detailing or project development, and then we have research, which is GXN. And it's very important to us that we are all under one roof, because the relationship between 3XN architecture and GXN innovation is really critical. We support each other. It's a symbiotic relationship between the research and innovation and then the classic architecture and what we can give to each other. So at GXN, we take research into practice, and we think of ourselves as a kind of a Swiss Army knife of knowledge and research. So we borrow and pull from many different domains, disciplines, backgrounds, so that we can cross-reference these and really then transform this knowledge into tools to help shape our architecture. So our output is very varied in terms of there's not one particular scale or typology. It's very broad in that sense. We're also very multidisciplinary. Now, this kind of changes depending on projects as well, who we have. But for example, our head of innovation core is an anthropologist. We have computer scientists. We've had a psychologist. So we think it's important that we have different disciplines, but also different nationalities and backgrounds, so that we really have different perspectives and unique angles. In terms of the type of work we do applied research. But we can further split that down into these three legs. So if we start with the research, independent research, externally funded, could be EU, could be some other national body like Real Dania. Then we do external consultancy, and that could be advising a municipality or a government. It could be collaborating with a manufacturer, and I'll talk a little bit more about this as we go through. And then finally, we have strategic design, which is chiefly with 3XN, and that's when we're involved with projects right from the beginning to help guide and shape the design. I like these next set of slides because it sort of says something about the different capacities and allowances between 3XN and GXN. So this is 3XN Architects, and essentially you start at A, you have a concept, you go through a process, and of course, as we all know, it's never exactly a straight line, but basically you're ending up at point B, which is the finished building. And hopefully, A and B, well, they look pretty much the same, right? So that's our aim, to keep it as clean and as faithful to the original idea as possible. Whereas at GXN, it looks a little messier, a little more complicated. And essentially, it's our role to test things, to explore, to mature ideas, to maybe also be disruptive in some ways. And we do this so that 3XN don't have to. In terms of output, that could be anything from, it could be, we've worked on new materials, I'll also come on to that too. It could be a new bit of code for robotics. It could be a book. We've published many books, which are all, I should say, open source and available on our website. Or it could be design guidance, whether that's for a competition or later on in project development. So it's very varied. So really, it's this synergistic, symbiotic relationship between the two of us. And the research helps shape the practice, and then the research goes back and studies through post-occupancy evaluations, for example, the results of that, learn new things, and so we keep feeding on. It's an evolving process, and it's really all about learning. Within GXN, we have three key focus areas, and those are behavioural design, circular design, and digital design. I'm not going to speak so much about digital design today. I will talk about the other two. And what's important to say here is that we see these as all essential components of sustainability. You'll see none of them say sustainability. It's because we've broken it down into constituent parts. And I think often where the real strength is and the real juicy, interesting stuff is in the overlaps between these different domains. So I'm going to start now on this first half that I mentioned, which is about circular design. Now, why are we doing this? We're really motivated here by the impact of the built environment on the natural environment and the huge amounts of resources and the impact on nature and the landscape, and the need to conserve resources, therefore, and be smart about that. These images kind of say it all. This is Shanghai in 1987. And here it is in 2013, and of course now even more so. So the speed and the volume of building is quite incredible. So it matters a great deal that we can do this in a way that is as lean as possible in resource use. I'm going to do something a little bit different. Usually I would just talk through various projects here, but because this is about the city, I wanted to talk a little about scaling up knowledge. From the component to city. So I'm going to start with showing you something at city scale, as more recent work, and then I'm going to go back and show you how a few other smaller scale projects have fed into this and allowed for scalability. So this more recent project is called Upcycle Amstel. Amstel is an area within Amsterdam, in case you don't know. And we were invited to be a circularity expert and strategic advisor for the city of Amsterdam, or Casper was. That's Casper there. He's the founder and owner of GXN. And we did this, of course, in collaboration with the city, but also with Delft, where we were running a master's unit at the time. You can see there on the right, this is actually two books, little companion twins. And the first book, this contains a context for the circular work in the second book. And this was the one where these fantastic students worked really hard with us in the studio to really understand what we were dealing with, both in terms of process and material on the site. So this included, and I'm showing you this because this is really relevant, whichever site you're looking at, to understand the context here when you're talking about circularity. So first of all, the basics of the construction chain, supply chains, and how we want to move from a linear one, which is just open-ended at demolition, to one where that feeds back in again into the loop. So there was some sort of general literature review and understanding of this. And then we become as local and regional as possible. So who are the stakeholders here? How can we engage with them? Who needs to talk to each other? Things like at the beginning of a construction project, it's not traditional to get a demolition expert involved at all, but we understand that that does become critical in circularity. So understanding, mapping out stakeholders, who needs to know what and when. And then the students did a fantastic job of going out in the area. And so this is an area which is tagged for a huge sort of redevelopment transformation. And so there were already buildings marked with red that are going to be demolished. And other buildings that are new and others that are retained. So they went out looking at all the buildings that were to be torn down, to be demolished, and mapped and calculated the quantities and qualities of the materials available. And this is a big exercise, I should say. This then gives us a kind of a palette that we can work with for the new buildings. So you can see on this little map here, these are the potential harvest locations and what we think we can get from these. And then we carried out an analysis of, well, what does that mean in terms of energy? And we calculated that we could have 28% embodied energy savings through upcycling so that we can feed this material back into the new buildings. So that was sort of the preparatory exercise. And then we made the second book here, Upcycle Amstel, about tools. And this, if you like, is what the city wanted from us. How could we formalise a process, a method for ensuring circularity? Again, looking back and understanding the existing context of policy. This slide is important because here, circular economy indicators, we felt that it wasn't enough to only talk about CO2 reduction, as important as it is, but looking at added value in different ways, culturally, through the economy, jobs, material savings, and so on. So throughout the book, we suggest looking at this sort of multi-strand approach to evaluation. We then created an atlas for solutions, and these are split into different areas. You can see, is this about leasing? Is it about upcycled facades? And suggested, sort of plotted that onto the site over which ones were relevant where. And then spatialize them in some way, in a diagrammatic, open-ended way, non-deterministic. But we always find this really important, the communication aspect of the work, so that people can begin to understand what it might mean, what it might feel like. It's not to be underestimated, that spatializing. Then we looked at dialogue tools, and both this slide and the, in general, looking at the whole process is about saying who needs to talk when, what decisions need to be made when. So that almost like you would with a REBA stage of works, plot onto that in terms of circularity, the sort of key milestones. Okay, so that was a more recent project, very much at a city scale, a very high level, and all about a sort of how-to manual. But we have some form for other how-to manuals in the field of circularity in the previous years. I'm going to quickly go through these. So Cradle to Cradle was one of the first that we did, and this was about taking Cradle to Cradle principles and reinterpreting them, tailoring them to both the construction industry and more specifically the Danish construction industry. And this book, again, was also very pragmatic, was also about a sort of how-to manual, if you like. So we split it into different areas. I realise a lot of this is in Danish, but apologies for that. So it could be about biodiversity. We had a chapter on energy, a chapter on water, and so forth. And really laying out in each of those what you do at each phase, what are the strategies, and how can you measure this? What we learned from that book, we also put into practice through projects which become case studies as well in the framework of research. So here we wanted to ask, what if we can build tomorrow with the waste of today? What if we can just design out the whole concept of waste? Here's Casper again. You'll notice he does turn up quite a lot in the photographs. So one of the things that we looked at was to do with the agricultural industry. And could there be a relationship between waste in agricultural industry and construction in the property industry? And one of the materials that we looked at are the stems on tomato plants, which grow incredibly fast and at the moment are strong and at the moment are just pure waste. So some of the cradle principles, as you might know already, but the idea is you want to separate biological materials and technical materials. When they get mixed together, you might call them Frankenstein materials. They're very different, they're impossible to recycle, let alone upcycle. So to keep these separate. So this project was then all became about biological materials. How could those be transformed into building components? So there's the tomato stems, the raw product. And then we also did look at other materials, for example, seaweed. And then looked at how these could be processed and turned into panel or sheet materials. And many of them have really beautiful textural qualities as well. And this could be an alternative to, for example, gypsum plasterboard. Well, I wanted to take that a step further. And so this became part of the sort of bio house where we built this. And at first it was purely about how these materials can be used, as you can see here, to line the interior and create this quite fantastic monolithic surface. But then we thought a bit bigger. You know, it's not just about the components themselves, but what about on a systemic level if we're talking about housing? And this was really one of our first forays into design for disassembly, because we studied then how the housing itself could be very modular, and therefore could be like a kit of parts that could be put together in different ways to create different sorts of housing for different and changing family types. And I think it was this, so that was a sort of scaling up from the material or component, starting looking at system. So with this next book, Building a Circular Future, we took that further. 89% is the percentage of construction material that is currently recycled in Denmark, I think anyway, which sounds fantastic and is great. The problem is, though, that this is what it looks like. So even though 89% is recycled, only 2% of the original value is retained. And this is clearly problematic economically, also as an incentive for sustainability. So we set out to really examine this idea that it's about value, not volume. In other words, it's about upcycling rather than recycling or even downcycling. So this is where we start to look a lot at the circular economy on the left there, the linear economy, where you take from nature, take technical nutrients, and everything ends up as waste, but how we can create these loops instead. And so in this book, it was separated into 3 core themes: design for disassembly, the circular economy, and material passports. And I'm not going to talk about all of these in detail because I have lots of other things I want to talk to you about today. But in terms of the design for disassembly, it really becomes very, very practical, as you can see here, on building sites, understanding the interfaces between various components, because this is where design for disassembly is sort of make or break area for that. So we then analysed all the different sort of typical intersections, slab to beam, slab to slab, column to slab, etc., within a typical building, and collaborated. I should say here actually that basically all of our projects are collaborative. We always work with partners. So in this, for example, we have a long-term relationship with PECO, manufacturer of concrete and steel, to develop these mechanical reversible fixings. So you can see here, these are embedded very neatly into the prefab concrete slabs or walls, whatever it might be, so that these at the end of their life can be cleanly and easily taken away and reduce wet trades, which also, by the way, helps with program. And I suppose the idea here is that if you were to walk onto a building site and see this site, You wouldn't know if this was construction or demounting. You can't tell if it's at the beginning or the end of life, which is true of circularity. So that's a collaboration very much there with a manufacturer. So how can we put these principles into practice? So again, I've got a project here to show you called Circle House. Now this is a huge project. I could talk just about this for the whole lecture, but in a quick way, this is hugely collaborative. These aren't all of the partners. These were the original ones. There are a lot more now. And really it was about in the Danish construction industry, people all coming together to share knowledge and work at different phases of the supply chain from different disciplinary perspectives. And the idea with the Circle House is to revolutionize Danish, what you might call social housing. So low cost housing made for everybody. And the goal is to create housing which costs just the same to build and to buy or to rent as traditional, so that the circularity, apart from the original design and research cost, it costs the same in practice. And so with this is looking at circularity and design for disassembly at all levels from the building, from foundation up through beams, slabs, walls, and so on. So the whole thing can be taken apart in the future. So one of the things that we did there was to build a demonstrator. And the idea with this was, of course, to test out some of these ideas in a technical way, but also very much to promote the idea. It's not only about the technicalities of construction, it's also about the aesthetics of upcycling, the aesthetics of disassembly. And this is the finished product. This is the interior, which acts almost as a showroom for it. And you can see some of the walls are stripped back. So you can see it's not only actually about design for disassembly, but some of these other aspects, circular economy. So, for example, the furniture is also upcycled. You can see the different sorts of insulation, which come from natural materials, and so on. This is sitting in Copenhagen, I should say. You can see on the left there, it's quite pedagogical as well, about explaining the different layers of the building and their expected differing life cycles, how it could be taken apart. And in the middle there, you can see this quite colourful cladding is actually upcycled plastic. And we also looked at other cladding choices in the middle there. That's burned wood, sort of Japanese style. On the right cork, we also looked at upcycled bricks with various other architects and designers. And the idea is that we can create this palette, which all can be easily affixed and taken off of the framework. So the final one in this circularity section, we take particularly the notion of design for disassembly further and apply it to a different scale, different typology, to ask what if an office tower could keep evolving. And this is important, it's a changing market with changing tenants in many of these spaces. So how can circularity also start to add value to the users of the building? So now we've left Denmark. We are now in, as you might recognize, Sydney. This is actually a refurbishment job, although it doesn't really look like it as the final thing. So you can see in red there, this is the existing tower on site. The smaller high-rise in front of it is actually heritage listed. It's one of the oldest high-rise in Australia. And so it's protected, so it's staying there, and our building wants to stand behind it, respect it, but somehow also make the most of the site and the fantastic views over the harbour. And so this is our design proposal, which is now on site. You can see it there also. I mean, amazing site. You couldn't ask for better. You can see a project by another famous Danish architect on the right-hand side there. So I'll quickly run through some of the bigger design moves here. So as I said, this listed high-rise in front. So our building twists and turns in order to keep its distance whilst offering the users fantastic views and light. We also then broke down the volume, so it's not just an extruded mass. And this is because the idea of human scale, a human scale tower, was really important to us. So sort of taking this idea of the city scale, but then stacking it, sort of carpet city, if you like, and then stacking that up into the tower. So I mentioned before, it's actually a refurbishment. So you can see on the left diagram there, we retained 98% of the structural walls. And then we added in the green this kind of an overcoat on top of that to increase the floor area and also transform it aesthetically. And we believe that we calculated that this would save 130 million Australian dollars. That's both in material and also time saved programmatically as well on site. So the design for disassembly component was kind of born out of this idea. It's a speculative office development. We don't know how many tenants there are going to be and what their wishes are. Would they, usually we would be proposing on the right-hand side there with some fantastic triple height spaces and atrium, but maybe some tenants don't want that. So how could we afford that flexibility? So that one can choose when you move in, if you're a tenant, yes, I want a 2-story high atrium, or we've grown, we desperately need more floor space, let's fill it back in again. So what we looked at was taking out this little U-shaped cut at the front of the building there and using design for disassembly principles, reversible joints, no wet trades, and so on, in order to make this piece removable as a soft spot effectively. A couple of things here is that we use completely standard steel sections, nothing bespoke. They are spliced together, mechanically affixed rather than welded, and most importantly, that they're sized in a way that fit in the goods lift in the building. And this is important so that if there is to be a new atrium added or taken away, that the building doesn't have to shut down. We don't have to close down parts of the building. It can keep on working and living whilst this happens. And this is actually on site now, this the very building that I was just talking about. And here you can see, I mean, we're definitely wanting to offer this as a possibility because we really believe in the power of these spaces in workplace design in schools and anywhere, and the power of design in terms of well-being. So here, this is kind of the pivot point, if you like, between circularity and behavioural design, and how that one of those overlaps that I mentioned at the beginning between sort of Venn diagram of those two fields. So I'm now going to shift into behavioural design. I think I'm okay for time. I'm just checking. So behavioural design is a newer focus area for us. This is 3XN's tagline or slogan, if you like, architecture shapes behaviour. And they've been working with that for as long as 3XN have existed, really. But just as the years have gone by, really sharpened up focus and articulated it even more so. It's a very Scandinavian idea as well, I suppose. But at GXN, we flipped that 180 degrees to say that behaviour shapes architecture, or at least it absolutely should and ought to. I want to speak a little bit about why behaviour is important, behavioural design is important. And one thing that we often say is that whether you're aware of it or not, whether you're conscious of it, the built environment is always affecting you, affecting your physical and mental and emotional health. And so if you're a designer, if you're an architect, whether you acknowledge it or not, you are a behavioural designer. We just try to be explicit and conscious of it. There's some amazing facts out there. I mean, the social sciences have, traditionally been harder to quantify, but there's across various disciplines, amazing research coming out these years. For example, research that says that your face-to-face relationships, your weak social relationships, not with your family or friends, but your community, if you like, is the #1 indicator of longevity, even more than alcohol or exercise, for example. The homes that are set in really green, let's say a really lush green courtyard, for example, report drastically reduced amounts of crime. But also even crime like domestic violence. And also that the daylight, something as simple as that architects, of course, are always keen to work with, really does markedly increase sales profits in retail units, even more than energy savings can do. So again, I mentioned again the economy, which you'll notice I do quite a lot. It's because we really do have this holistic approach to sustainability where you've got environmental, ecological, of course, the social, and also the economical. So I guess what I'm trying to say here is that behavioural design is essential to sustainable design. And that's because we believe that if people don't feel good in places, if people don't want to stay there, if they don't want to look after them, if they don't grow to sort of treasure them in terms of their identity and sense of place as well, they're not truly sustainable. This rather complex looking diagram here, this is us as a working document, if I can say that, of us trying to map out, okay, how do we work with behaviour? When we say behavioural design, what do we mean? So there's 4 key areas in the middle there. Movement, that can be about wayfinding, also about how to get people to stop in a building. Connecting, that's really about connecting to other people, feeling part of something bigger, so a sense of belonging. Well-being, of course, is a very hot word these days, and it's not for us though just about the physical aspects of it, you know, ventilation, daylight, and so on, but also psychological well-being, including biophilia there, which is a really critical area. And then finally, experience. This is about a sense of place, it's about sensorial atmospheres, and also about emotive moments. You know, what does the environment, how does it make you feel, and how does that affect your, whether it's performance at work or learning at school and so on. Another important tool we use in our behavioural design is this 3 nested circles diagram. And it's because we think at 3 different scales. We start at the individual level. This is all about comfort. How can we design for people to have a sweet spot between stimulation and calm, so people aren't under or overstimulated? Social structure, how can we create a framework, a kind of a stage for social relations? And cultural, which is all really about identity and the expression and embodiment of values and ambitions. And what we believe is that we need to address all of these and that they need to work together. You know, if one of these is out of sync or forgotten, you know, it is going to be less successful as a built environment. So I'll go through each of these and give an example of a project which addresses some of these issues. I'm slightly nervous now because I'm about to show you a project that has a couple of short animations, and I hope random music doesn't play. Let's see. Anyway, so at an individual level, this is by no means an exhaustive list, but I wanted to give you an idea of some of the research or theories that underpin the behavioural design. For example, prospect and refuge, sometimes called savannah theory. This is about a really instinctive need to feel protected, but also to have an overview and an outlook to the environment. Think about if you go to a restaurant, nobody likes sitting in the middle of the floor with your back to the door. It's just this sort of a very deep instinct within us. And this principle applies in workplaces just as much as it does in the design of a landscape as well. Other ones could be mystery and intrigue, which sounds very fluffy, I realise, but really it's about our enjoyment of environments which change, which aren't monotonous, but that you get new experiences as you move through them. And then on the other end of the line, proxemics. So that's, as you might have heard of this before, about how we have different distances that we're comfortable from people, whether it's a very intimate distance with your lover, or at work where you want a good, well, at the moment, 2 meters is, I think we are all aware of that. Corona has definitely spoken to proxemics, but we draw on these different theories to start to set up design guidelines or principles. And I want to show you how some of these have come to life in our children's hospital here in Copenhagen. So this is the site, and we've done a few other projects there in black for the hospital. It's the biggest in Denmark, I think. But this particular project is in your children's hospital. Good, no music, I'm glad about that. So here's some of the basic design concepts. It was conceived of as 2 hands because there were quite different functionalities to house, which there is some overlap between, but they needed separation. And then imagining extending these hands out to create these fingers with terraces at the end of all of them. And I'll talk more about why as we go through here. So this is a children's hospital. You know, it's a really vulnerable group of not just the children, but their families. And we felt it's so important to design for their well-being. And so we had these 5 principles that really are the foundation that the design was built upon. Integrated play, designed for everyday life, see me, ask me, let me, the good journey, and clear zones. And I'm going to go through each of these, how they relate to wellness, but more specifically how they were translated into design ideas. So starting with the play, first of all, and we should say this bit here was in collaboration with Rosenbosch, other architects here in Denmark. So we look together into different benchmarks, different types of play and why it's important. For example, the emotional side or the cognitive or the physical. So, and then you can see these icons in the middle, created this as a palette of what we needed to cover. We then made, this is in Danish too, but I can tell you that it says play specification. So we're used as architects having door or window specifications. This is a play specification. So we took it seriously and we approached that systematically. So looking at the different age groups and which areas, what times of day would this be, and so on. So sort of categorizing it and really understanding it. And for example, then splitting it into the physical play or the emotional play or whatever that might be. So once we had the specification, we then made it spatial. So looking at, for example, in the entrance areas, how that might differ to something which is deeper into more private areas, different sorts of play that are relevant there. Design for everyday life was this very simple idea of domesticating the hospital. There's children here that are here for really long periods of time, and their family are staying with them or sometimes coming and going. So how could we design the hospital as home? And by doing that, we really took this idea of a classic house and how it has different levels of privacy. As you move deeper in, you kind of get the heart of the house, which is very social, and then more private areas and buffer zones and so on. So this was the metaphor that we brought to life. So for example, here you can see this is outside of a private room, and we created these little niches or alcoves, so that there was this sort of threshold in between private and public. You had a sort of semi-private area that you felt was your territory and you had control over. You could feel part of something bigger, but also really great spaces for maybe difficult conversations as well. We also then looked at things like color. Now, this is not what it looks like, because this was an early idea. And so, I think started thinking, bright, cheerful colors. But then we looked more into color theory and actually the importance of colors which soothe, which are gentle. We believed that to be really critical. So the color palette as well was part of the design. In the rooms themselves, of course, ample daylight, views, different sorts of surfaces for sitting or lying and so on. Also the materiality here, we've got a natural material in these walls, something, they're customizable. And so the idea is that children can have some influence on their room, just as you would at home, put drawings up or whatever, that they could then have options over what sort of style they want, so that they felt they had some control back in their life, as well as creating a more domestic style atmosphere. See me, ask me, let me. Here really, so at the eyes there that you see, this is where the nursing stations are. And the idea is that everyone is equidistant from these nursing stations. So everything is easily accessible. And this also helps about noise, about acoustics. So that it's in the middle, it's more like the living room, it's noisier, it's social, you can go there. And as you move further out along these fingers, it becomes more quiet and calm and private. And the good journey, I think actually for me what's most important here is that because of these fingers, this kind of cul-de-sac design, so often in hospitals you can feel like your bed's in a bit of a corridor and there's constant traffic through, people and things going back and forth. But here with these cul-de-sacs, it means that it does feel more private. So you have this journey from the approach of the building up through the more social spaces, but then only the people who are living or working in each of these fingers is there. It's not a corridor, it's not circulation. And then finally, very simply, clear zones, just the clarity of where things are and how to find your way back. Hospitals can often feel like mazes as well. So here's a plan. This project's on site, I should say. But you can see here at the end of each of the fingers, there's a kind of fingernail, which is a terrace or a garden. And this was really important for us, and biophilia is something we use on many, many of our projects. When we talk about biophilia, we split it into two. On the left there, we talk about direct nature. This is what most people think of with biophilia, so bringing nature in and around buildings. But equally important is the research backing up the power of design and abstract or indirect nature. This is more like biomimicry, if you like, because both of these can have marked effect on your health and well-being, as well as things like increasing social interactions and identity and so on. So just to further clarify what those the difference between these, direct nature in the top line there. So we start with visual connection. Again, I think this is maybe the most popular interpretation of biophilia, but then we expand that to look at multisensorial, you know, as they're the scent of particular flowers, variable indoor climate, where that sort of sense of it not being a stagnant, monotonous indoor climate, but there are different areas, for example, places with natural ventilation, unclimatized spaces, and so on. Dynamic light to tap into our circadian rhythms and make sure you get a sense of passing of time during a day, and awareness of natural systems. This is also things like seasonality. And then the bottom line, abstract nature, is about biomorphic forms. We really respond well to curving lines, to natural materials that can age gracefully and show some patina, biomorphic patterns, whether it be fractals or repetition, and this idea of complexity and order as well. I think we really respond well to sort of nested scales of detail so that we don't get huge blank facades, but as you go closer to a space that you read more and more detail into it. So these are some general principles that we use, and I think this project's a really great example of it. So we looked at each of these fingers on every level having its own outdoor space, which could be themed differently depending on orientation and so forth and what kind of wards were there, but really integrating that fully. But then also on the abstract side, a number of things here, these beautiful sinuous curves, and also the tactility of the material, the level of scale in the natural materials as well. And so you get these really fantastic overlapping terraces. It almost feels like being in a tree house or something like that. And this is the finished building. That's also on site. It's nearly finished, actually. So in not too long, I will have proper photographs of it. So social structure. I think I better speed up a little bit here for time. So social structure, good social relations. What that means depends purely on the project. It's different for every project. And what I want to talk about here are stairs. We have a real love of stairs. It's like obsession with stairs at 3XN and GXN, because we believe that they can be incredibly important in terms of promoting social interactions. We actually had Mila, who's a psychologist who wrote a PhD with us, really all about staircases in large-scale atrium, just like this. This is our UN city building in Copenhagen. But this particular project, this is a school that we designed here in Copenhagen called Ørsted, and it's quite a radically different sort of a school, certainly compared to the one I went to, in that there are no classrooms really and no corridors really. It's very open. It's more about zoning and using different levels and architectural means to separate space. And it's been incredibly successful as well. So and you can see right in the center here, there's this large timber spiraling staircase. That was hard to say. So what Millie did was that she went back and did a post-occupancy evaluation. This is her PhD here. So she studied how many people were there, at what times, and what were they doing, importantly. And what we learned from this is the importance of landings. More than the actual treads of the stair themselves, the landings and the space around the balustrade, that is where people meet together. That's where you feel sort of comfortable to stop and wait for someone. You can people watch. It has many benefits there. And so here you can see here they're saying the stairs, they connect more than floors. They connect people just as much, and they facilitate all sorts of social encounters, walking together socially, looking out, and so on. So again, I use this slide to say, so this is where we've learned from something that we have built and then feed it back into the next project. This is our International Olympic Committee building completed about a year ago in Lausanne. I could talk a whole lecture just about this building, particularly its sustainability credentials, which are very high. But what I want to talk to you about is the stair in here. The stair has this very unique design. It's based on the idea of the 5 Olympic rings and these being stacked and angled throughout the building. So it has this strong symbolic function. But we also wanted it to be a bit more than circulation. And so we took this learning about the importance of landings and these kind of in-between spaces, interstitial spaces around the stair, and really sort of put them on steroids, blew that up to be something much bigger. So that the idea being this was also a space in its own right. So you can see here then on the stair you have to walk all the way or halfway around to go up to the next level. So that these spaces which otherwise could have been just kind of circulation or dead space then become almost like lounges or meeting areas in their own right. So you can see this is one of the circles and then the next one above. So to go up, you have to walk around again. In a sense, it's saying that circulation is not only about efficiency, it's about effect as well. And then finally, cultural identity. This is about expression of values, embodying, whether that's a company or a community or an organization, how can we consider identity and placemaking? So now we're back in Australia, in Sydney, as you can see. This is Sydney's existing fish market. And maybe what you notice here, first of all, about the building is that it's not very inviting. It's not very welcoming. You have all these rows of cars in front and also huge amounts of trucks coming in and out, industrial, but it is indeed open to the public. People do go there. It is popular, but it's a little unsafe and it's not very welcoming. But then you go inside it and it's this amazing sensorial experience, the sights, the smells, the textures, just, fantastic space. So this project was really about how can we rethink, reconceptualize what the fish market is and how can it become a place of culture just as much as industry. You can see here, so in the red dot is the existing fish market, the yellow dot is the new site. So really prestigious site, again, right along Sydney's really fantastic harbour walk. There you can see, well, I can't point, so it's a little bit difficult, but maybe this next, here you go. So on the right there, the existing, and here's the new. And you can see some of the reasons why we had to work quite hard to make this be part of the cultural experience of Sydney and be part of this promenade, this walk all the way around. Because the site is, this is a very busy road, Bridge Road there. There's a park on the other side where it's really disconnected. And it's one of the few areas where there isn't this sense of really making the most of the waterfront. So what is a fish market today? It's the fishing side, of course. You've got boats and fishermen coming in one side, and then everyone else, whether you're a consumer or an industry, coming in the other. And what we wanted to do was really expand and open up that idea of what it can be so that it becomes a public anchor, so that it becomes a cultural space. And so we retain the authenticity and the industry of the fish market, but we bring that together with other experiences. So it kind of opens up, it becomes more extroverts rather. And this so that the building, rather than be a barrier there, that this becomes a connector, connecting there along the promenade and from water to park. Some of the issues we had there that we had to find creative ways around was, on one hand, on the left, you've got these big vehicles, trucks and ships, and on the other hand, you've got people. We want people to come there on foot. So how do you work and bridge between these two scales in a way that's safe? And how do you do this in a way where you can retain the authenticity of the fish market and that it still works? It's not just sort of Disneyfied, but at the same time that it is attractive to people. So what we looked at, this is just one example here, is how the promenade and the roof, which are the two sort of key elements of this building, can rise and fall to meet each other so that you have, actually, can I point? No, I can't. Oh, I can. So we call this staging, so that we would raise people up on foot here and then have all of the industrial actions below. And what this means is that this almost becomes like a stage set where this is the audience and you can watch this happening. you're safe. There's no problem with the transport and infrastructure there. And you can see here down in this section, that's what we do. We lifted up areas so boats can come in and pull the roof down there. So that these are two different levels which can see each other whilst still having some independence. And we also then looked at how we can blend these different functions. So this is looking at short-term adaptation. So how can the auction hall, which is this amazing, loud, fantastic place where the fish is auctioned off every day, but that happens very early in the morning. So how can this have other meaning, other identity and use at different times of day? So designing that in a way that can be used for example, markets, farmers markets, fish markets, or how it can be an a cinema or a theatre in the evening. So again, bringing in, with culture, so important to get different groups of people, different users, understanding their different needs and really weaving and braiding these together. And then doing the same thing at long term. So at the moment there was quite ample car parking, but thinking how could we make the most of the space for the city as well as the fish market longer term, if we, as hoped, start phasing out the amount of cars that we use. So again, how could this be created, cut holes in the slabs there so you can get this fantastic space for events or a gallery or whatever that might be, sports space. And here you can see some renders of it. So as I say, yes, the roof is this, again, there's a lot we could talk about just there, but the roof is this waving function that covers everything. But really the promenade here and all of the urban landscape is working really hard to bring these functions together. So you can see here as it swoops down, creating this kind of amphitheatre type space and a new public space for the city. And on the other side here, you can see where ships and lorries and so forth can come in, while safely people can continue that loop without being broken. At different times of day, so within here, there's all sorts of eating experiences and markets. And again, I mentioned this word authenticity. So whilst you're in here shopping or eating or having a meeting in an event space, whatever that might be, that you can see this auction space. Here are the fishermen, here are the tradesmen in this space bidding for the fish. So it brings these worlds together and creates a bridge between them culturally. That is what I wanted to talk to you about today. And I've loosely titled this about being behaviourally driven and materially bound, which is something we often say here at GXN, that we need to be holistic in how we approach sustainability. And that's true for whether you're talking about a small pavilion or a whole region or city. Thank you very much.